Hello, and welcome to the Najat Foundation Media Institute. Today's panel is entitled International Response to Lebanon's Rising Humanitarian Crisis, Challenges and Solutions. And this is under the project of renewing Lebanon's political and economic structures in partnership with the Public Affairs Section at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. My name is Youmna Naufal, and I am a Communications Director at Brunswick, and I will be moderating this session today. And the session is quite important because, as everybody knows, if you've been watching the news, a severe economic and financial crisis is causing tremendous hardship in Lebanon, and tremendous hardship for the people of Lebanon specifically, a quarter of whom are refugees, forcing an unprecedented number of them to rely on humanitarian assistance. The World Bank has described this crisis as one of the most severe globally since the mid-19th century. With the collapse of virtually all sectors of the economy, large segments of the people have lost their means of subsistence and access to essential services, including nutrition. The situation requires a critical humanitarian intervention with an understanding that a purely humanitarian intervention is unlikely to improve the long-term outcome. So we need to also address the needs of refugees so that it doesn't fall through the cracks of the worsening situation in the country for its citizens as well. And if the overall situation is not improved immediately, an approach that involves the need and rights of both Lebanese is going to be necessary. And today we're going to see what are the challenges of the international response to Lebanon's crisis and suggested solutions. And with us today are four esteemed panelists, and I want to introduce them to you, starting with the two gentlemen in our studio, His Excellency Ghassan Hasbani, the former Deputy Minister and former Minister of Health in Prime Minister Saad Hariri's government. After completing his studies in London, he occupied several industry leadership positions in Europe and in the Middle East. He is a current and former member of several boards of directors for multinational companies with various sizes in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Welcome. Mr. Ralph Taraf is currently the ambassador of the European Union to Lebanon. He is a German diplomat who was previously the representative of the European Union in Jerusalem, covering the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and UNRWA. Before being assigned to Jerusalem, he served as the ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Welcome, Mr. Taraf. And the two ladies on our screen, Mrs. Najat Rochdi, the current UN Deputy Special Coordinator for Lebanon, UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon since the 1st of August 2020. Rochdi brings over 20 years of experience in development and humanitarian assistance and international coordination in conflict and post-conflict areas, including through her latest assignment as Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy for Syria and Director of Peer-to-Peer with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Welcome, Ms. Najat Rochdi. And last, but definitely not least, Mona Yacoubian, whose work centers on conflict analysis and prevention in the Middle East with a specific focus on Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. In 2019, she served as executive director of the congressionally appointed Syria Study Group, which USIP was mandated to facilitate. She joined the U.S. Institute of Peace after serving as Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Middle East Bureau at USAID from 2014 to 2017, where she had responsibility for Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Welcome, Mrs. Yacoubian. So I want to start with you, if I may. How are you doing?
I'm very well.
You're good? Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Thank you for being here. Happy New Year to you. You know, I was thinking as I was reading through the news in Lebanon, making all these headlines, probably for the wrong reasons these days, but the political dysfunction that is prompting this humanitarian emergency for Lebanon, and you know, we have to argue that it's economic and also political in structure. It's also converging with the ongoing Syrian refugee crisis, and I know that's always been pretty much a highlight and a headline for Europe. Donors have mobilized support for refugees, but they have not adequately addressed the rising crisis among Lebanese. And I wanted to know, could you tell us more about Europe's stance specifically when it comes to aiding the Lebanese people, separately from the refugees? And then we'll talk about the refugees.
Yes. Well, with pleasure. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. The European Union and its member states have never considered the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon as purely a crisis of the refugees. So our support has never gone exclusively to the Syrian refugees. What our approach to the whole topic was to support the host communities, which host the Syrian community, the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, to cope better with the refugee population. So, to give you a very practical example, in the healthcare sector, of course, we wanted to improve the situation of healthcare for the Syrian refugees. We support Lebanese primary healthcare centers, and in particular primary healthcare centers in rural areas and where Syrian refugees are located. So the support goes to a Lebanese institution through an international non-governmental organization. And we see that Lebanese actually profit more from these institutions than the Syrians themselves. And still, our support goes there. This has been a trademark of our support to Syrian refugees throughout. We had programs which were designed in the beginning exclusively, more or less exclusively, for Syrian refugees, like cash assistance programs. But this has developed over time, and the more the economic crisis in Lebanon hit Lebanese, the more our social assistance goes to Lebanese and less to Syrians. So we, as a standard rule, but that was applicable a year or two ago, our support went roughly 50-50 to Syrians and to Lebanese equally. Now, the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon is, as you said, the consequence of a political crisis and an economic crisis, and the response to this crisis needs to be adequate to the reason and to the cause of this crisis. So, remaining humanitarian strictly, as you said, will not resolve the crisis. We need to support people in need, but we need also to look beyond that.
You know, I just want to follow up on something that you said. You know, this increasing humanitarian aid for Lebanese could help slow the collapse of the state. Analysts today are saying Lebanon is a collapsing state. Some analysts say it's already collapsed. It could also give donors more time to push for reforms. However, many argue that the aid currently being sent is not effective, and we know that donors' highest priority should be to maximize the effectiveness of humanitarian aid. As EU ambassador to Lebanon, I know you play an important role in renewing, if you will, kind of the architecture of the humanitarian framework. What are currently the biggest challenges that you are facing?
Well, one of the there are many challenges. We're not short of challenges. Certainly, one of the challenges is mobilization of funds. Because if you determine that this crisis is a humanitarian crisis, you basically pool into humanitarian funds, and then you start competing with places like Yemen, Somalia, the Great Lakes, and I'm not so sure that Lebanon would be very performing in this competition, if I may say so. I think we need to see what Lebanon needs. Lebanon definitely needs humanitarian support for Lebanese people. But Lebanon needs, more than anything else, a way to address the underlying economic crisis. We have to see the sequence, how the crisis developed. The crisis in Lebanon started as a debt crisis, became a banking crisis, became an economic crisis, and this economic crisis became a humanitarian crisis. We need to go upstream a bit to address the issues. And one of the major issues there is that the economy needs to be put back on its feet. And to do that, we have been discussing with the Lebanese government, with this government and with the previous government, the necessary steps which need to be taken. It's all called reforms, and it's a bit misleading because it's not really a reform only, but it's a very specific set of measures which have been repeated time and again, and I think that all the stakeholders in the Lebanese system understand the necessity to act on these issues, but we do not see actions. There are always reasons why there cannot be action, and things do not go forward. To give you a couple of examples, if you really want to get the economy back on track, you need to attract private investment. No investor will put any money in a place like Lebanon where you don't have a banking sector which functions, where you don't have capital control laws, where you cannot be sure that as investor you will be able to get return on your investment, where there is 5 different administered exchange rate plus a market rate. And this is just a totally chaotic situation which will not be very conducive to mobilize the needs to invest in the country. So there is a list of things which we constantly repeat, and where there is an agreement with the government and other stakeholders, not just the government, that they need to be addressed. A forensic audit of the central bank, unification of the exchange rates, a banking sector reform, passing a state budget, and all these kind of things to bring back some order into the economy and to bring back some structure. If you want, the framework for this is the discussions which the Lebanese government is having with the IMF, because the IMF is the institution which can frame such a discussion.
I want to get back to reforms in government
Yes.
and ask His Excellency Hasbani a few questions. But before we get to the government and what that's going on, as you know, it's a lot of drilling because people want answers. I just want to turn to Ms. Mouna Yacoubian, because just building on what Mr. Taraf said, as we have discussed previously, Lebanon is in throes of compounded humanitarian crises. When we talk about the Lebanese, we also talk about the Syrian refugees. Ms. Yacoubian, how do you believe we could change how the international community views Lebanon? Because in the media now, it is not portrayed in the best of light. And we, as Mr. Taraf was saying, there needs to be reformed. Humanitarian aid in many ways is conditional based on these reforms. And we're not always seen so favorably because of internal structures and the internal way of doing things. So how do we change that?
Well, thanks, Youmna, very much. Thanks for the invitation. And let me start by first agreeing with everything that Ambassador Taraf said. I do think what's important for the international community, and of course I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., so Lebanon is far, far away from here. And Lebanon, while I think the United States has placed great emphasis on trying to help Lebanon in its time of need, it is the largest humanitarian donor as a country to Lebanon. At the same time, I don't think there is a full appreciation by the United States or by the international community more broadly of just how severe and significant the humanitarian crisis is in Lebanon for the Lebanese, as well, of course, as for Syrian refugees living in Lebanon. But when we think of Lebanon, the classic view of Lebanon is it's a solidly middle-income country, very urbane, sophisticated. When we look at the statistics and the very dramatic decline that the country has witnessed over the past 2 years, poverty rate of 80%, a third of Lebanese being food insecure, Lebanese children, not going to school because of issues around poverty. That's where I think the international community must become more aware of the severity of the crisis, not just for Syrian refugees, but for the Lebanese as well. And I think we need to really alter how we think about Lebanon. I think there needs to really be a paradigm shift, in a sense. Let me underscore, humanitarian assistance is not the answer to Lebanon's problems. It's an immediate solution because of the suffering. But I think ultimately, as Ambassador Taraf has also alluded, there needs to be deep structural reform. What I think is lacking there is clearly the political will to undertake those reforms on the part of the Lebanese government. And so that, frankly, is the conundrum that the international community faces. A growing and increasingly severe humanitarian crisis for the Lebanese, one that's actually transforming the country before our eyes, and yet the unwillingness of the Lebanese government to undertake the necessary reforms to help put this country back on a more stable trajectory.
All right. I guess it shouldn't be this way, but speaking of political reform, I'm going to turn to you, Your Excellency Hasbani. A UN reporter recently described Lebanon as a failing state, as I was telling Mr. Taraf. Yet, as we've heard Ms. Yacoubian say, Lebanon's government is an issue, and it is unlikely to address the drivers of the crisis since many politicians view reforms as an existential threat to their wealth and ambitions. As former Deputy Prime Minister and former Minister of Public Health from December 2016 to January 2020, and therefore you have an insider viewpoint on how things work in terms of the political class. What do you believe are the biggest challenges that the government currently faces, and do you have any confidence or trust in today's leaders to lead Lebanon out of this darkness it's facing?
I'll start by answering your last question. Simply no. No confidence, no trust. Second level of the answer is when we talk about the government, I would say what government? Lebanon has no government. Let's be very clear. We're all trying to hide our heads in the sands, pretending there's some kind of sovereignty available out there for the international community to deal with, simply because to a large extent, the international community doesn't have processes to deal with non-state actors and non-government situations. When you're dealing with a refugee situation, there's a host country with a government that you deal with, usually. But now you're dealing with a population who are refugees in their own country, with no government in reality in place, no recognized entity by its population. Yet, there are no real mechanisms to deal from the international community with any other entity than that who is in power. This is creating a conundrum. It's creating a situation whereby you need to get the right support to the population that's being impoverished day by day. Yet, on the other hand, Lebanon is still considered to be a middle-income country on paper, somehow, incorrectly.
Still?
Yeah. Ask the World Bank. They would still tell you Lebanon is a middle-income country and has no access to special funding as in other countries who are classified as low income, for example. So that's still a dilemma. Lebanon is still using its reserves incorrectly to keep prolonging the agony of the population with a slow death, basically. The international community now is probably struggling as to whom to deal with. You deal with the government to help the people, then this government will take the help and use it for its own purposes, for prolonging its own existence. So you will be funding a state structure that is rejected by its population and expecting it to help its population. Take education, for example. Very few countries are able to provide direct education help to private institutions, for example, in Lebanon, because their systems don't allow them to provide direct help to private institutions. So they can only help public institutions. Yet public institutions, we know how they are being run and how politics is being involved in controlling the public sector, for example, education system. Healthcare, similar situation, and so on and so forth. So the avenues by which the international community can help the Lebanese population directly are quite limited by the nature of their processes, yet they have the intent to help. Yeah. So everybody is stuck with this so-called government structure that's dysfunctional, and this is where we come to the failed state structure situation. Yet the change is not happening, and there is no way, zero chance, to expect this structure to conduct any kind of reform, because had they wanted to do that, they would have done it a long time ago.
Okay, I hear you, and on paper, the solution seems simple. A forensic audit of the central bank, followed by strong structural reforms to the financial and public sectors, as you were saying. But what I want to know is, why are people in power today so reluctant in conducting those needed reforms that could unlock billions to help the country?
Simple. When you audit a firm or an institution,
right,
you bring someone who's not involved in the operation to audit it.
Right.
You can't expect those who are accused of failure to audit themselves. And it's basically an impossible situation that we're finding ourselves into, no matter how much you hammer the message.
They don't want accountability.
It's basically, you need to start creating the change first, then you create the accountability on top of that. You can't hold people accountable by themselves holding themselves accountable as in a failed state situation. So we're not talking about a professional environment.
I hear you. So what would be the first step to a solution?
Change
How?
change. The people of Lebanon have to change. Now, for the people of Lebanon to be able to change, they need to use any democratic mean available at hand. However, if they're impoverished, hungry, worried about their lives the following day, and they're getting drip feeds of support from people in power, this will empower those people in power further, unfortunately.
Okay, so but today,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry I keep interjecting
Yeah.
because they are hungry, they
Yeah.
are tired, they are frustrated, they're
Sure.
at the rope's end. So what should they do? Today, if you are addressing the Lebanese people and you're calling for this change, what should they do? What are the 1, 2, 3s? You should do this, this,
One,
this.
two,
to
three
change.
is change the current political structure. The current
Elections.
Elections is the first route. Other routes have been chosen before, they didn't reach an end. But elections is the first route. But to be able to create that change, we keep hearing the term empowerment and enablement. For the population to be empowered, they need to have the basic minimum of life. And if this dilemma of aid and international aid is still there, trying to help those people through the government, the very government they're trying to change, and the very parliament they're trying to change, this is only going to create another closed loop of feeding the system from within. And the people in the end, they don't realize where this support is coming from. They don't know that, for example, the EU is supporting them with this, or the United Nations is supporting with that. All they know is that this help is coming through this and that political entity that exists in government today, because the international community cannot deal predominantly directly with those people. So until those mechanisms are done through either the NGOs or directly to people, the same way they get delivered to refugees in other countries, there needs to be a mechanism whereby people are empowered further, and more independence is given to those people to create their choices. We might end up having the total opposite effect. And even if elections happen, the worst that could happen is that the current political system and the current power players would benefit from this poverty further to be able to control the vote of people and control the will of people further. So the biggest issue in Lebanon is one of empowerment of people, one of empowerment of democracy to start with, and this would be the starting point in everything else. Reform would follow immediately afterwards, accountability would be put in place, and then, as His Excellency Taraf was saying, international financing doesn't have to be just support, it could be investments even, would come quite easily, because what you just mentioned, the solutions on paper are very straightforward, very clear, and they don't take, it's not a rocket science to actually implement them.
I want to get back to that, because I think the solutions, unfortunately, we've reached a situation where it's not so simple any longer. It's a lot more, it's going to take a lot more time, and it's going to take
My
a lot of
estimate
players.
is for every day of delay in initiating the reforms, we have at least 10 days of reform that are needed. So basically, if we delay by another year, that's another 10 years before we reach the point of stability.
We're going to come back to
Yeah.
that. I want to turn to Ms. Najat Rochdi, because since 2015, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the UNDP have co-led the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, which seeks to merge humanitarian and development responses. However, a European official recently argued that when it comes to humanitarian aid, less than 30% of assistance is going to host communities. And an international official said there has been no evidence that the LCRP, the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan, has achieved any of its development goals. What comments do you have on the matter, and what is the reality of the situation on the ground that you have seen?
Thank you very much, Youmna, and very happy to see you both, your excellencies, and of course, Muna. I mean, we had a long chat when we met lately. First of all, LCRP was not developed nor meant to address the scope of the humanitarian needs that today the Lebanese are facing. And one has really to be very clear about that. So we cannot assess how the LCRP is supporting the Lebanese while it was not actually formulated and developed for that. LCRP has been developed to address the Syria crisis impact, to provide protection to the refugees, and to provide support to the host communities. Until 2019 and early 2020, the host communities themselves did not have the same needs we see today. Before, the host communities did not have needs in terms of food, for example. The host communities did not have needs in terms of, support for education. Host communities did not have the same needs in terms of access to health services. So therefore, based on the delivery of the assistance that happened before, yes, I am sure that the host communities did not get the same amount and the same level of assistance and support that the refugees, because that was not needed on the one hand, and second, it was not anyway part of the strategy. That's my first point. My second point, and it's really important that I clarify that, because I heard you say in it, Youmna, it's not correct to say that humanitarian assistance is conditioned. And we need to be fair to the international community and to the donors. They condition the recovery, they condition the development, they condition, of course, all what is related to investment, but not a single donor has ever conditioned humanitarian assistance, whether for the refugees or for the Lebanese. This is a very important humanitarian principles that we will always stand for, and which actually all the international community is very supportive of. I think it's really important that we don't mislead, the public opinion about what is going on. Is there a room for improvement in the way humanitarian assistance is provided under the LCRP? I am sure there is. But for your information, and as you already know, for actually to address the gaps in terms of support and meeting the needs, the humanitarian needs of the Lebanese, we came up with the emergency response plan, which of course came with a number of challenges as well. And that was one, because the humanitarian needs for the Lebanese are across the country, while the LCRP is covering only 256 districts. And as you know, Lebanon is more than 2,000 districts. So it was very important actually to make sure, as per the humanitarian principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality, to at least assess the needs and address them across the country. That's one. Second, we have put in the ERP only the sectors of needs for the Lebanese. In the refugees' humanitarian needs will always remain much, much, much bigger than the ones of the Lebanese. It's a fact. I mean, they are much more vulnerable, but also they are concerned about much more sectors than the Lebanese. And when it comes to the humanitarian needs of the Lebanese, this is covering food security, and therefore it is also covering malnutrition. Unfortunately, we are starting seeing malnutrition among Lebanese children, which is really the first time ever. It is covering health, it is covering education, and it is covering access to water. So we have actually two response plans, one which is the LCRP that exists since 10 years, and that is addressing the host communities and limited to 256 districts. And the other one, the ERP, which is complementing actually the LCRP and addressing only the needs of the Lebanese and the migrants. The problem, and unfortunately, because Lebanon is a middle-income country, because the humanitarian assistance is not the result of a conflict or a disaster or natural disaster. We got very little funding for the emergency response plan, which is, less than 12%, which is really, really very low. And this is where there are really issues in terms of gaps when it comes to addressing the humanitarian assistance. Over.
Thank you for that. I think I want to just ask you one more question, just to kind of build on what you were saying. How do you solve the greatest challenges that the UN is facing regarding the coordination of the aid?
It's an excellent question. There are many challenges, as Ambassador Taraf mentioned. Beside the challenge of the funding, of course, there is a challenge of the coordination. There should not be any issue in streamlining the coordination, in theory. It takes the goodwill of everybody, really, to be willing to be transparent, to be accountable, to be guided by the humanitarian principles, and more importantly, to start any planning with a joint needs assessment, which is addressing and assessing the needs of everybody, regardless of their status. And then, based on that, start planning the humanitarian assistance for the most vulnerable. There has been no humanitarian response plan which has been 100% funded since ever. And we have always worked that way. As humanitarian, we do a joint needs assessment, then we have a mapping of all the needs, regardless of the status, be it Lebanese, be it refugees, be it migrants, because we need also to keep in mind that today we have also very serious humanitarian needs among domestic workers, because a lot of Lebanese families cannot anymore afford to pay them, and therefore they are left with almost no income and with a huge and very vulnerable situation. If things are done that way, with the joint needs assessment and with delivery of humanitarian assistance and prioritization based on vulnerability, goes without saying that the refugees will remain the most vulnerable, but at the same time, we will do in a very impartial and independent way actually the delivery of humanitarian assistance to all the Lebanese as well. And in such case, coordination is a natural, a natural mechanism. What we had to do, unfortunately, in Lebanon is that not only we had to manage, of course, and we still have to manage the Syria crisis response because it is needed there, but we had also to create an ad hoc coordination mechanism for the response to the Beirut blast, because we could not afford to wait until everything is in place. And then, unfortunately, the humanitarian situation deteriorated so quickly that we had also to manage and to try to come up with something, because our only motivation and our only driver was to make sure that we were saving lives and addressing, the humanitarian needs and providing the donor communities with the assessments regarding the needs. Now, it's about time, really, to sit together. And it's not only a UN issue. As you know, in the humanitarian arena, it's never United Nations alone.
Right.
United Nations, without the national and international NGOs, we won't be able to have any operation. And one has to recognize that to them.
Thank you.
And the donors as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to build on what you're saying and go to His Excellency, Mr. Rauf Taraf. What do you think can be done today, building on what was said, to structure a more fluid and comprehensive humanitarian program for the Lebanese?
If you allow me, I would like to just make a short comment, because I heard, or I thought I heard, I don't know if it's accurate, that we should not deplore the fact that Lebanon is still a middle-income country. On the contrary, this is a very strong indicator that there is something wrong with the distribution of wealth in this country. And you should start in addressing these issues. We should not, in Lebanon, try to settle for a humanitarian logic where you turn citizens who are empowered into beneficiaries, and you create the sense of dependency and entitlement to international aid. We should actually try everything we can not to get there. So as much as it is relevant and needed to support people in need, and I agree with the UN resident coordinator on that, humanitarian assistance is never conditioned on anything. It follows the imperative of helping people in need. But we should not settle in for a purely humanitarian logic in Lebanon, because in doing that, we would create a vicious circle. We would create a mindset which is not really appropriate for Lebanon. We should go back to identify as much as we can economic opportunities, economic possibilities, where you would attract foreign aid, development aid, where you would attract private investments to get out of the crisis and not to basically settle in the crisis. And I think this is a very, very important point which I would like to put forward. Because the recipes, as Mr. Hasbani said, are known. We should continue to insist that the Lebanese decision makers, I'm not talking about the government, and this is deliberately because the government in itself is not capable of pulling it all by itself. The Lebanese decision makers, when I talk to them bilaterally, one-on-one, they all concede that. Nobody questions that in the discussions I'm having with them. But there is a big problem to collectively get there. And this is where we as international community have also a role and responsibility to help Lebanese decision makers to get there without becoming too intrusive, in full respect of the sovereignty of the decisions Lebanese decision makers have to take for their country, because we don't know better than they do what is relevant and what is important for their country. So again, as I said, for me it's important that we not settle too quickly into this kind of humanitarian mindset. Having said that, I think we definitely can improve the way we work with regard to humanitarian assistance. Our mode of operations as European Union, but I think most big donors go this route. We fund UN agencies who then work together with international and national NGOs to deliver the aid. We do not, in large parts, go through state agencies. The education sector is a big exception, because you cannot make programs in the education sector without passing through state institutions. But we make sure that money is not reverted to places where it should not go. One of the big dramas of the whole concept of development assistance, humanitarian assistance, in the last couple of years is that when I arrived to Lebanon 2 years ago, we still had a number of investive expenditures, investment projects in the pipeline. In 2018, we had the Cedr conference, which pledged 11 billion euros for investment into the infrastructure of the country. The European Union alone pledged 1 billion euros in infrastructure projects like electricity grid, road transportation, water, wastewater treatment, waste management, and so on and so forth. These pledges have never materialized because we were not capable to create the environment in which these pledges would make sense for the reasons which were mentioned. And we have all shifted as donors, and I would not call it humanitarian, but to fund consumptive expenditure. So the money we give is spent on the spot, and it doesn't have any kind of economic effect. What we need to do is to reverse this trend and to try to go back to at least partially fund also investment. On the humanitarian side, I think humanitarian assistance is humanitarian assistance. You give it to the needy. The challenge there is to organize it in a way that you really address the needs properly, and that you make sure that the money goes where it's most needed. It's a technical issue. It's not a political issue. It requires expertise of how to handle these things, but the expertise is present in Lebanon. It's not that we lack this expertise. And the rest is a question of coordination and communication and all these kind of things. But it's not, I would not consider this, the fluidity of the humanitarian assistance, to be the major challenge in the humanitarian sector. The humanitarian sector As Najat said, the major challenge there is mobilizing the funds.
And I want to move this to Mona Yacoubian, Ms. Mona Yacoubian. There's always this issue of is it getting to the right people? Are the funds getting to the right people? Obviously, are there enough funds? How do we mobilize the funds? How do we ensure that they get to the right people? Specifically with the current scarcity of assistance. Even though it is coming, there are still a lot of challenges to get them to the right people at the right time. How do you view this? What are your comments on this, and how can we move past that?
So I think, listening in particular to Ambassador Taraf, I think we need to think of this in terms of short-term challenges, long-term challenges, and then the broader context in which all of this is taking place. And here again, I think it's important. I certainly would want to underscore Najat's very important point about the nature of humanitarian assistance and its impartiality. I think what's changed, and what I still think we need to grapple with a little bit more, is that the humanitarian landscape, the needs landscape in Lebanon, has changed dramatically in a very short period of time. When the U.S. first started to initiate its humanitarian assistance in 2012, and it's been nearly $3 billion in assistance since that time, the focus rightly was on the Syrian refugee population and helping not just the refugees, but those host communities in Lebanon. What's changed is that the Lebanese humanitarian needs, the humanitarian needs of the Lebanese people have increased significantly. I would underscore the issue is not to try to turn Lebanon into another welfare state. The international community cannot absorb one, nor is that good for Lebanon. However, I don't see how we get around the immediate, short-term, very urgent needs on the humanitarian front that the Lebanese are now facing. Again, to repeat that statistic of 80% of the country living below the poverty line. Mm-hmm. That is a significant transformation. And while Lebanon certainly has the human capital, at least for now, that will hopefully one day help bring it out of this crisis, there is actually some significant concern about structural changes that are happening. Brain drain. People that are able to leave are leaving. And again, this issue of children not being able to attend school, Lebanese children. I mean, these are significant challenges. So the way I would view this is, how does the international community think about the short-term humanitarian needs of both the Lebanese, vulnerable Lebanese and Syrian refugee population? By the way, in a way that doesn't deepen tensions between Lebanese and Syrian refugees. Because whether it's true or not, if there's a perception among the Lebanese people that they are not receiving the same amount of assistance as needed as the Syrian refugees, that's problematic. So I think that's the first short-term, very urgent challenge. And here, I think, and I would really defer to Najat in particular, the idea of cash assistance directly to the most vulnerable Lebanese is the answer. And how to do that most effectively, again, I think Najat is best placed to answer.
I actually, yeah. Who's going to answer that question? Because I think it is a very important one. When going back to what you were saying in terms of, and I really would like this. I know it's a panel, but I'd really like this to be a discussion. And please feel free to comment on each other and interject each other, because this is how the Lebanese way goes. But Mona, back to your very, very important point: the short-term challenges and the immediate need for those to be addressed. Does anybody care to venture into an answer?
I can address part of it. What is really adding to the vulnerability of the people, it's really the lack of access or the very limited access to basic services. And we should not forget that the access to basic services is also the best way to preserve their dignity. Today, access to health, access to education, access to water, access to food, all of that is jeopardized. So if there is a short term, it should really to address those gaps and try to find ways, meaning that we need to work not with the local authorities as well. The second thing, and that is something we started, and we are working very closely actually with the European Union on it, is a social protection. This country has never had a comprehensive and integrated social protection that actually would protect the most vulnerable and avoid in the future such deterioration of the situation and rising of humanitarian needs. That said, I fully agree with Ralph when he says that we don't want to set up Lebanon into a protracted crisis. But at the same time, people are dying. I'm sorry, I was sharing with Mona that last week we had a whole family who died because of winterization and because they could not afford any fuel, so they brought wood and they slept with that and then they died. Many things like that, many tragedies like that are happening. If we want to give a chance to the country really to recover from the situation and to have the energy and the willingness and the trust in a better future, we need to support them today. We need to make sure that we don't have a whole generation of Lebanese who is sacrificed because they drop out of school, because now they are part of the labor market. We need to make sure that we don't have malnourished children, and we need to make sure that we are addressing and mitigating the tensions. And we talk a lot about the Syrian refugees. We should not forget the Palestinian refugees as well, who are also in a dire situation. So the combination of all those very difficult situations are all bringing us back to basic services. And for me, that will be the immediate emergency in terms of recovery. It calls on reforms, it calls on investments, but more importantly, it calls on everyone to take its responsibility. Over.
I have it.
I like how she says over. And I'm gonna get, because it's so far from over, Miss Najat. But I want to give just Muna a chance to build on that, and then we'll come to you. Hold that thought. Muna, any comments to what Najat was saying, answering?
No, I would agree with it. The only other point I would make is, again, to be very clear, I think in the absence of action today, the situation continues to deteriorate. The Lebanese lira has continued to plummet. All of this then speaks to the longer term issue of, again, in my view, the lack of political will by the Lebanese government. And here I think Ambassador Taraf is being quite diplomatic. I mean, the fact that there have literally been billions of dollars on the table in assistance pending reform, not humanitarian assistance, but development assistance, okay? Assistance conditioned on reform. And that successive Lebanese governments have refused to undertake the reform necessary to access those billions of dollars, I think really is a point that has to be underscored and highlighted, because it puts the international community, quite frankly, in a very difficult no-win situation. I would never advocate for my government to support providing an IMF to vote in favor of an IMF package in the absence of the kinds of necessary deep reforms that Lebanon has long needed. And so that's the long-term challenge: is how to move this country and frankly an intransigent, entrenched, and quite corrupt political class toward the kinds of necessary reforms that are needed in order to bring the country out of crisis. Over.
Your Excellency, over.
I really don't wish to get back into a discussion that's been going on for many years, and Ambassador Taraf and I have had this discussion several times over about the behavior of governments in Lebanon and the political class, to whom I've always been kind of opposed, and I've had an issue with, starting by setting up the SEDR conference and working very hard to get these programs in place. And I can announce from this platform that Lebanon actually does not need $11 billion even to properly invest and recover. It probably needs $3 to $4 billion initially, maybe up to $6 to $7 billion. But the numbers that have been discussed are more than generous to get the infrastructure and the economy back on its feet, and that was back in 2018. Right now, let's put the political discussion aside, because we all agree that reform is needed. More pressure on the political decision makers is required to get these reforms in place. But in parallel, we cannot ignore the fact that there is a humanitarian situation that's evolving and developing. And perhaps today it is not as visible as in other countries where famine and death is much more emphasized and scores higher than Lebanon, as you said. However, we're approaching very quickly towards that situation in an exponential speed. So how can we make sure that enough food, enough medical care, and enough basics on education and shelter are available to the Lebanese population in order for this population to survive the political changes that are necessary to happen in the country? Some of these political changes are internal, some of them are external. There are so many complexities within that. So two things that the international community need to be heavily engaged with urgently right now. One is to step up the pressure by all means on the political, not just reform, but change area and angle. Secondly, rush into the aid of the people directly. For example, Lebanon has several hundred primary health care centers and facilities that can actually receive direct aid through aid agencies, NGOs, etc., because they're NGOs by themselves. They're not government entities or government run. Those are in desperate need today for direct support. And they've been choked by the Ministry of Health for the last several years, two years specifically, 2 to 3 years, because the funding that was provided for these primary health care centers by the World Bank has been halted by the successive Hezbollah ministers because of a disagreement on transparency of distribution of funds through the Ministry of Health. And I was involved in securing those funds with the World Bank in my tenure. So today, people cannot be hospitalized. People who are in need of heart surgery, of kidney, not transplant, of actually dialysis, basic treatments and basic surgery is no longer available to these people. So primary healthcare centers, as well as core treatments in hospitals, and I'm saying at least the same level of coverage that Syrian refugees get in health coverage, is an immediate action that needs to be taken. Otherwise, we'll actually have more deaths from lack of hospitalization and treatment than we had from COVID in the last 2 to 3 years. Secondly, we talk about basic food supplies and medication. That, again, does not need to go through public channels and governments. It can be delivered directly to people. Thirdly, when we talk about food supplies and or cash support, very quickly and very easily, digital money can be placed in action where people can receive that support directly in an audited and transparent manner, again, without going through the government, through direct financial aid to those people who need it, the same way as the Syrian refugees are getting it. The Syrian refugees don't get the cash through the Lebanese government or the Syrian government. They get it directly from UNHCR. That could be put in place as a program for the Lebanese people in need. I understand what Ambassador Taraf is saying about, yes, we need to enable people, we need to invest in small enterprises and medium enterprises, reinitiate an economic cycle that gets those people empowered, and not fall into the mindset of a humanitarian assistance, because we're not there yet. We're not at the kind of Somalia level or such a Yemen level, etc., because there's no physical and military conflict taking place on the ground. Yet we are getting there indirectly through different means, by the devaluation of the currency, by the economic stumbling, and by a continued passive government and public management. So if the political situation is going to take longer to be solved, with all the pressure that's being exercised, we need to address the other situation. This is not the basic humanitarian yet, but it's essential support, because the structure, the current situation, the current economic structure is turning into a humanitarian crisis very, very quickly. And we cannot hide from that fact. When we talk about the income of Lebanon and Lebanon being classified as a middle income country, because when you classify the country, you're still using an exchange rate of 1,500 liras per dollar, and you would still classify Lebanon, because officially this is the official exchange rate. But if you look at the 30,000 liras per dollar, definitely the GDP per capita is now among the lowest in the world. And that is the situation, the parallel situation, very unique situation in Lebanon. It's creating a kind of parallel humanitarian situation that is hidden by official numbers and by bureaucracy. And the reason, again, one of the reasons behind this is also we have people in the political system today still trying to get everything channeled through them, still trying to pretend to the world that they can be a partner in reform, is still trying to utilize any financial aid that come to Lebanon through them for political purposes. Because in the end user, I repeat that, the end user sees the money coming from these officials, from these public institutions. They don't see them coming from the EU or from the UN unless they are coming directly to them. And we still have the same old system utilizing that same old trick to gain more power and more control over these more and more impoverished people. That's what we need to cut off right now. And there is enough data and evidence to show that there is a humanitarian crisis. It's not as bad as other countries, but we're getting there if we cannot address it right now.
I want to start.
Youmna, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I really need to clarify.
Please, go ahead.
Direct assistance is already happening. I mean, and I have really to be very clear about that. And, the cash assistance, the multi-purpose cash assistance is really what is needed.
Yes.
What is missing is the scale. It's not the mechanism. And actually, even the World Bank, in, the social safety net they are putting in place, they are capitalizing on the United Nations mechanism that exists with the WFP.
Yeah.
So direct assistance is something we have adopted since day one when it came to the humanitarian needs for the Lebanese, working obviously with national NGOs and international NGOs. I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not going to say...
I agree to this point. It is the scale issue that needs to be addressed, and it is the cash issue that needs to be addressed, definitely, in augmenting the capacity of these models that have succeeded in the past, have also been tested with the Syrian refugees on the ground, so the mechanisms are in place. It is a matter of getting the donors to accept those mechanisms at a wider scale, also to getting the value of aid and support augmented and delivered through transparent mechanisms. This is what I was referring to the electronic money. Because when cash exchanges hands, cash is fungible and it creates a lot of chaos. When digital money is being used, it can be better controlled, more transparent, and international agencies can actually see for themselves how the money is being distributed without it being utilized by a corrupt political system that's trying to benefit from this.
You need things to work digitally, actually,
Indeed.
for that to happen.
Indeed.
I do want to move on to 2022. This is a new year and kind of solutions. Let's see if there's any hope. And since we're on this topic, this is going to be an important year for Lebanon for the parliamentary elections. They're scheduled to take place in a few months. Obviously, an obvious question is, do you think those elections will be held on time? But also, I think it's important, more than that, will we witness a change in the political makeup of the country as a result, or will it be just the same? I'm not asking the politician that you are. I'm asking the Lebanese citizen that you are.
Which I've always been.
True, but
Indeed.
taking off the political hat for a second, is there hope in that? And then I'd like all our panelists to weigh in.
I believe the gate to the garden is the elections. This is a first step to start creating the change, no matter what the scale of that change is.
Right.
And citizens who believe that there are politicians who do not act in the national interest and the best national interest, they should start acting in their own best national interest as Lebanese citizens. And everybody has to work towards getting these elections to happen. While, of course, you wouldn't expect a regime who has full power and full control of all decisions to just easily relinquish that power and allow the people to make that change. So democracy has to be protected. People need to be empowered to independently make their choices without being coerced or put under any unnecessary or dubious pressure. So that is the first step, transparent elections. Irrespective whether it will actually turn the table or it will create an incremental change, it is a necessary path forward and entry point. So this is the gate to the garden, basically. Because it's the people who have to change. Parliament needs to be different in order to produce a different type of government, not any government, that is capable of conducting the reforms that are necessary to unlock not just the international support, but the value that exists in Lebanon that can still be unlocked to set the path for recovery. The alternative is to prolong the agony of the Lebanese people with more artificial subsidies and squeezing of whatever is left of reserves and gold reserves and special drawing rights from the IMF that were issued for Lebanon, etc. That could actually prolong the agony for 2, maybe 3 years with the current situation, with a gradual deterioration if the elections do not happen, if a change does not happen. So we have to put all our efforts, international community, Lebanese people, for this last mile, the next 5 months leading to the elections, to make sure they happen transparently and fairly. Otherwise, we're entering into a very, very dark period.
Any comments on that?
Well, yes, I would have a lot
Please,
of comments.
please, go ahead.
Well, I personally refuse to talk about Plan B and scenarios where things would not go the way they are foreseen by law. And at least all the decision makers are on the record that the elections will be held on time. I decline to talk about alternative scenarios, what happens if. We should not start talking about hypothetical scenarios which everybody agrees are not good for the country. So we work towards the holding of the elections on time. We are ready to support the process. We have already supported the process financially through UNDP. We are very much involved in helping the Lebanese organizing that. And we are ready to deploy an electoral observation mission. Now, when people hear that, they say, well, yes, but you can't just observe on the election day. Mind you, we're not that naive. An electoral observation mission starts its work months before. And we had already the technical team coming and assessing the situation. We know that we need to watch the issues up front, and we also need to look at systemic problems which exist in the electoral setup from start. So this is something where we practically actually are already engaged and work on the assumption that the elections will take place on time. That is point number 2. And you asked for 2022. The same goes for the issue which I mentioned before. The government has repeatedly assured us that they will sign an agreement with the IMF. Well, the deadline has elapsed. The first deadline has elapsed. That was the end of the year. It did not materialize. Now the next deadline is in the coming weeks, but we would very much like to take this government by its word that an agreement with the IMF would be signed before this government goes out of the office, and we will do everything which we can do to bring the government there, to support it, to take that path, and to organize other issues. And we will continue, of course, to try to mobilize as much funds as possible to alleviate the hardships we were talking about. So these would be the 3 issues, I would say, which are on the top of our agenda for 2022, at least seen from today.
Thank you for that. Mona and Najat. Mona, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in. Look, my concern is I don't think we should necessarily take the government at its word about elections being held on time. I think it's actually critical for the international community to underscore now and in the coming weeks how critical it is that elections be free and fair and held on time. And in particular, I think both the US and the EU together should be aligning themselves and their messaging on this because of just how critical the elections are toward, as a first step toward putting Lebanon back on a path of recovery. And here I would also underscore, Youmna, to your question, I mean, no, I don't think the elections are going to be a be-all and end-all. They won't solve everything, but they are an important step toward gradual change. And that's really what I think Lebanon needs, is gradual political change. And therefore, again, I would underscore the importance of the elections and that they occur on time, that they be free and fair. I do think the US should also be mobilizing support for pre-election programming and training, as well, of course, as for observation, and I would hope the US will do that. Lastly, I think this issue, I just want to go back to the humanitarian assistance question and the point that these mechanisms are in place, but there's simply not the scale there. And I think to address that point, it is critical, again, that the international community understand the depth of the current crisis and its urgency. It's hard to mobilize more assistance given all of the competing demands that are out there. We haven't talked about Afghanistan either, which is yet another huge concern. And quite frankly, the fact that this current crisis in Lebanon is largely, and I think correctly, viewed as being man-made makes it all the more difficult. That said, in the absence of providing the needed scale of humanitarian assistance, I fear Lebanon becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, that it falls deeper and deeper into poverty and into the kinds of structural changes that will be very, very difficult to correct going forward. Thank you.
Najat, over to you.
Yeah, well, it's very difficult to add to what was already said. I fully agree with all what was said. And yes, election is only one step. I mean, that is not the miracle and the golden key for everything. There is no other choice but obviously to go ahead with the reforms. And there is a need to restore the trust. I think a lot of the crisis in Lebanon is really a trust deficit between the citizen and the government, trust deficit between the different politicians, trust deficit between Lebanon and other countries, whether in the region or outside of the region. And it's so important to restore this trust. And the only way, and that's a principle that applies everywhere, including individually, you restore the trust when you deliver on what you promise. Thank you.
Any last comments that you want to, after hearing them talk, just looking forward? I do, it does make sense that elections are only one step towards change, this really incredibly important immediate change that is needed. And as Mona was saying, what Lebanon also needs is gradual change, because it's been in these trenches for far too long. Will they be held on time? That's still a question that is up in the air.
More importantly, will they be properly held transparently? I hear His Excellency, and I've had the discussion with the representatives from the commission that's been put in place. They're initiating their work. This will help quite a lot, actually, towards transparent elections. But, of course, we do not expect those who may derail the situation to carry the smoking gun ahead of their action, of course. They're going to all support it. They're going to all be pretending and giving the messages that they're supportive of holding elections. I'm talking about the internal entities involved. Observing everything is going to be very difficult, but nevertheless, having observations in place is important. However, another important point, going to the framework that was voted in by European Parliament for sanctions. I would love to see some teeth and action before the elections, actually, to show seriousness and effectiveness of those measures, given that this framework is allowing for not just corruption, but also derailing the democratic process, and human rights abuses, which are plentiful in the country. So it would be good, again, to demonstrate that this framework is actually being put in place, to act on it before the elections, so that the impact of that action on the elections will be also positive, because some people may still think that they can get away with so many things and pretend that everybody doesn't notice that, and things will go on. Because any instability days or hours or weeks before the election date, and we don't have another chance for rescheduling the elections because it's been scheduled just at the end of the term, which means Parliament would have to be extended, which creates another complexity. I know you don't want to think about scenario B, but to ensure that scenario B doesn't happen, action needs to be taken ahead of time. That's my final say about this.
I want to...
Youmna, sorry.
Yes.
I mean, you encouraged us to interrupt, so I'm going.
Please interrupt, please.
You know, there is one thing, I mean, since you were talking about elections, I really want to bring the attention of everybody to a very worrisome phenomenon, and this is really the hate speech that we really see growing in the social media, but also in the normal media as well. If we are to expect those elections to lead to something that is constructive and positive, and not to add actually to the polarization and the divide in the Lebanese society, it's really important that this issue is tackled, and that every single media professional, but also every single politician or candidate are very, very aware of that, so we avoid to add to the crisis another crisis.
Thank you for that. I think listening to the four of you, I want to take this opportunity to thank His Excellency Mr. Hasbani, Mr. Taraf, Mrs. Yacoubian, and Mrs. Najat Rochdi as well. I think there's a lot going on, the compounding effects of the Beirut August 2020 blast, the massive economic collapse, only exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course the constant political corruption, the dysfunctional, mismanaged crisis, and of course the responses to it that have proven inadequate thus far, and there's still a long, long way to go. But I think it's important to have these kinds of discussions, because there always should be a place for hope and a place for solutions, because when you have more problems, you need more solutions. And Lebanon is in need of help from the international community, and it can't do this on its own, but also it can't do this without local change. I think moving into 2022, it's going to be important to think about reforms, economic development, and also hopefully the well-being, social welfare, national and regional stability as well, that can contribute to Lebanon getting back on its feet, which is the hope of everyone here. Thank you so much. Thank you to the ladies on our screen. Wish you were with us today. Want to take this opportunity to wish everybody a happy new year and a healthy new year wherever you are. I hope you're keeping safe and healthy. And a big thank you to the Najat Foundation once again, the Media Institute, and the Public Affairs section at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut for organizing this project. And it's important to keep these conversations going, because you never know who they help, who's listening, and how change can come about. Thank you.